The show opens up in the bustling streets of New York City, where a door suddenly appears and leads to a forest. A middle-aged man named Henry Fogg steps through the doorway and sits on a bench. While he settles in, a worried woman approaches him. She places a dead moth on his newspaper and warns him that it has already begun. The woman insists he must act quickly to bring them into the fold. She then hands him a pocket watch and explains that it's for emergencies. In the meantime, the protagonist, Quentin Coldwater, sits in a therapist's office at a mental health clinic. He is waiting for the doctor's approval to leave. To pass the time, he performs a simple coin trick, making a quarter disappear. The doctor watches with a smile and jokes that he must be popular at parties. She then asks him why he thinks he's ready to leave, because his file clearly mentions clinical depression. Quentin explains that he feels better now. The doctor, however, advises him to continue treatment. Quentin disagrees, pointing out that since he hasn't made any threats of self-harm, the clinic cannot keep him. Shortly after, he is released. Quentin then heads to a graduation party at Columbia University, where he notices a girl in rainbow shorts dancing across the room. Meanwhile, his best friend, Julia Wicker, is chatting with her boyfriend, James, and their friends. Feeling bored, Quentin retreats to his bedroom, which is filled with magic trick props and fantasy books. He then begins reading The World in the Walls, the first book in the Fillory and Further series. The following day, Quentin and Julia arrive at a small neighborhood for his Yale alumni interview. When no one answers the door, they cautiously step inside and discover the interviewer's body. Shocked, they immediately call for paramedics. One of the paramedics, a woman named Eliza, hands Quentin a package left by the deceased. Eliza is the same woman who had chatted with Fogg at the beginning of the show. Later, Quentin opens the package and finds a manuscript for the rumored sixth book in the Fillory and Further series. While walking down the street, a gust of wind catches one of the manuscript's pages, and Quentin chases after it. Meanwhile, Julia enters a building and presses the elevator button for the third floor, but the elevator descends to the basement instead. Quentin follows the floating page into a dark alley, while Julia finds herself in a brightly lit hallway as the elevator doors open. Quentin then emerges from a thick bush into a sunny field with a school in the distance, while Julia sees a sign pointing her to an exam. At the school entrance, Elliot Waugh, one of the seniors, greets Quentin. He mentions that Quentin is late and guides him for an exam. When asked if this is a hallucination, Elliot responds with a vague question about whether that would even matter. Once they arrive, Dean Fogg introduces himself as the head of Brakebills University and tells the group to focus on passing the exam. The test begins, and the questions in the booklets constantly shift within seconds. After the exam, Quentin hands in his booklet and is given a card showing where to go next. While in line, he spots Julia, and they share a quick hug and exchange stories about how they arrived. Their reunion is cut short when Fogg urges them to move along. Later, Julia meets Professor van der Weg, who explains that the purpose of the exam was to reveal any hidden magical abilities she might possess. He tells her that while she may have had magic at some point, she no longer does. Devastated, Julia insists she can't go back to her old life now, that she knows about magic and Brakebills. Van der Weg explains that her memory will be erased, and she'll be given an alibi for her absence. While he prepares to remove her memory, Julia cuts her arm with her ring when he isn't looking. In another part of the school, Quentin meets with the board. Dean Fogg asks him to demonstrate his magic using a deck of cards. Quentin tries a simple card trick, which amuses some board members. Frustrated, Fogg clarifies that he means real magic. Quentin then makes another attempt, but Fogg pressures him. He questions if Quentin would rather go back to his unhappy life in the city. Angry, Quentin says no and tries harder, and suddenly, the cards erupt from his hands and float in the air. He then arranges the cards into a castle on the table before collapsing in shock. While unconscious, Quentin dreams of a large tree with a clock embedded in its trunk. As he reaches for it, he encounters a character named Jane Chatwin from the Fillory and Further books. Jane warns him that the beast is coming for him at Brakebills. Suddenly, Quentin is surrounded by a swarm of moths and wakes up in a dorm room at Brakebills. In the meantime, Julia wakes up in her apartment with James in New York City. Confused, she notices the scar on her arm and realizes that she wasn't dreaming at all. Determined to learn more, she begins searching online for information about Brakebills. Back in his dorm, Quentin meets his new roommate, Penny, whom he recognizes from the exam. Elliot and his friend Margot Hansen arrive shortly after and give Quentin a tour of the campus. Later, during a class, first-year students are introduced to practical magic. The professor asks a nerdy girl named Alice Quinn to demonstrate a spell. The classmate Katie Orloff Diaz mocks Alice from the back of the class, and Penny jokingly calls her a master magician. Ignoring them, Alice performs a series of gestures, melting a glass marble and reshaping it into a small horse figurine. Everybody, especially Quentin, is impressed by her magical abilities. That night, Quentin finds Alice in the cafe studying a book with an eye on the cover. He apologizes for his friend's behavior and compliments her magical skills. A week later, Quentin talks to James on the phone. The latter is extremely concerned about Julia's strange behavior. He mentions that she hasn't been eating or talking much and reminds Quentin about her upcoming birthday. Our hero agrees to attend the party, accompanied by Elliot and Margot, as he still doesn't know how to return to Brakebills on his own. At the party, Julia asks Quentin to convince Brakebills to test her again. She shows the scar on her arm and explains how she can't forget the experience. Quentin, however, tries to comfort her and suggests that magic isn't the only path for her. He tells her she's capable of excelling at many other things, even if she can't do magic. Later, in the restroom, Julia's shirt buttons mysteriously fall off, and she is suddenly pulled across the room. Confused, she watches as a mysterious man enters the room. He kneels beside her and taunts her about feeling powerless. However, Julia breaks free and summons flames from her fingers. Impressed, the man calmly extinguishes her fire and reveals that his intentions weren't harmful. Instead, his group was testing whether Julia was truly a magician. Julia is intrigued by his words and demands to know more about his group. Meanwhile, at the Brakebills library, Quentin hears an unusual knocking sound. Following it, he steps through a door and finds himself in Fillory, the magical place from Fillory and further series. There, Jane Chatwin appears and tells him that Fillory wanted him to be there. When he notices a symbol on a stone, she grabs his hand and thrusts it into the stone. He suddenly wakes up at his library desk, the symbol now burned into his palm. Remembering it as the sigil from Alice's book, he bandages his hand and shows the mark to her. At first, Alice brushes him off but changes her tone when she sees the symbol. She explains it means contact the other side and asks Quentin to help her with a summoning. However, to perform the ritual, they need a specific book locked away in the dean's office. Elsewhere, Penny struggles to focus on studying with Katie. Distracted, he admits he's hearing strange voices and feels compelled to find them. Meanwhile, Quentin and Alice prepare for the summoning. Alice explains the ritual is to contact her brother, Charlie, who mysteriously died at Brakebills 5 years ago. She admits that her real reason for being at the school isn't her love for magic, but to uncover what happened to her brother. Just as they realize they need more participants, Penny and Katie show up and offer to join. The group completes the ritual with incantations and looks into a mirror. However, nothing happens. Disappointed, they clean up and leave the room. After they're gone, the mirror briefly shows a foggy image and a drawn smiley face. The next day, Professor van der Weg gives a lecture when, at exactly noon, the clock suddenly stops. Dean Fogg notices his watch has also frozen and rushes to the classroom. Inside, everyone except their eyes is magically paralyzed. A man with a face covered by moths steps out of a mirror. He turns out to be the beast from the other world. He calmly walks through the room and uses dark magic to kill the professor instantly. When Fogg arrives, he confronts the intruder by casting spells to stop him. However, the man easily overpowers Fogg and brutally gouges out his eyes. He then turns his attention to Quentin, steps closer, and covers his mouth. The scene suddenly cuts to the aftermath of the attack. Professors try to piece together what happened and question the students. Quentin's scattered memories of the beast's attack surface in flashes, moths everywhere, the beast killing the professor with a gesture, and then covering Quentin's mouth. Dean Fogg's eyeballs placed on a desk, Alice casting a spell amidst the chaos, and the mirror shattering. Meanwhile, Julia and the mysterious man whom she encountered earlier at the restroom arrive at a rundown building. He introduces himself as Pete and describes the building as an old meatpacking plant. When Julia notices a star tattoo on his arm, Pete explains these marks are earned over time. He leads her to a room where his associates are gathered. The woman then introduces herself as Marina, claiming she's new. Pete takes Julia and Marina on a tour of the plant, but as part of his lesson, he tricks them into a meat locker, locks it with magic, and leaves them inside. He then says that they need to figure their way out. Back in the classroom, more details of the attack are shared. Quentin remembers Dean Fogg's watch disappearing and reappearing in his hand. Students recall unfreezing and rushing out while Katie hurled magic at the beast. Alice also attacked with magic, forcing the beast to retreat through the mirror. Penny then shattered the mirror once the beast vanished inside. Professor Sunderland explains the beast is from another world and should not have been able to enter due to the school's protective wards. She warns that if a student is found responsible for letting it in, they will be expelled. Meanwhile, Julia and Marina search for anything that might help them escape. Julia quickly realizes this is some kind of test. Using her smart thinking, she figures out a spell to generate warmth and save them from freezing to death. After a couple of tries, they are finally able to free themselves. Julia explains that there was no magic involved. She unscrewed the door using scissors. Outside, Pete and the rest of the group applaud and explain the test's purpose is to teach that not everything is solved with magic. Julia, frustrated with constantly proving herself to Pete, is further surprised when Marina says Julia wasn't proving herself to Pete but to Marina. Marina then rolls up her sleeve and reveals an arm full of star tattoos, far more than Pete's. Turns out, Marina is the boss here. She then offers to mentor Julia and teach her everything she knows. Marina also hints that much of her magical knowledge comes from stolen resources at Breakbills. Later at night, Pete and Marina wait in a car for someone. Surprisingly, Katie steps in and hands a spell book to them. Marina gives her another list of items to steal, clearly controlling Katie in some way. A few days later, Dean Fogg, who was attacked by the beast, is discharged from the infirmary. Now wearing dark glasses, he addresses the first-year students about real magic. He announces that it's time for the test to determine their discipline, the area of magic they are naturally skilled in, so they can be trained to master their abilities. Once the class is over, Alice enters for her discipline test and impresses the physical magic professor, Professor March, with her magical skills. He compliments her and confirms that she excels in physical magic. Quentin, on the other hand, is tested by Professor Sunderland. She runs through various magical categories, but quickly determines that none fit him. Later, Quentin shares with Alice that his result was undetermined, meaning they couldn't identify his discipline. Alice, however, has a rare ability called phosphoromancy, which allows her to control light. That evening at a dorm party, they discuss the summoning spell for Alice's brother, Charlie. Alice still wants to give it another shot because she's desperate to know what happened to her brother. Quentin then suggests they try a locator spell. They walk outside with a match and wait for it to light. The match mysteriously ignites in front of the Woof Fountain, a fountain surrounded by rumors of being enchanted, bottomless, or cursed. Sadly, they see nothing unusual, so they leave the place, disappointed. Moments after they walk away, an arm ominously rises from the water. The next morning, two students gossip near the Woof Fountain about people who supposedly died there. One of them curiously leans closer to the water when an arm suddenly grabs him and pulls him in. He struggles to escape until his friend helps him out. Hearing about the incident, Quentin and Alice grow concerned that the spirit in the fountain might be Charlie. However, Alice is unsure because if it were Charlie, she believes he would have sent her some sort of sign. However, when they return to her room, they are shocked to find it filled with a dozen animated glass horses. Alice recognizes them as a spell Charlie once taught her, making her realize that he might really be reaching out to her. Elliot suddenly interrupts and pulls Quentin aside, saying he needs help right away. He's holding a rattling box and explains that Professor Sunderland had visited the library looking for a book, which has now gone missing. Elliot managed to distract her, but if the faculty realizes a book is gone, they'll investigate, and that could mean big trouble for the physical kids, especially with all the parties they throw. Elliot opens the rattling box, and a book flies out and flaps wildly around the room. He explains that this book is Volume 2, and it will lead them to its missing partner, Volume 1. Meanwhile, Alice decides to ask Margot for help with Charlie. Margot doesn't know much about what happened but remembers there was something strange involving the fountain. She suggests that Emily Greenstreet, a student from Charlie's year, might know more. After Charlie died, Emily took it badly, dropped out, and disappeared. Margot adds that Dean Fogg gave Emily a job after she left, which means they were probably covering up something big. Elsewhere in the school, Penny follows a voice in his head and walks into a room where psychics are peacefully meditating. A student named Camille welcomes him, saying she knew he would come. She explains that the building has meditation areas where psychics can process their emotions. As Penny meditates, more voices fill his head, and suddenly he hears a cry for help. He opens his eyes, stands up, and finds himself standing on a rooftop in Shanghai. The scene then shifts to New York, where Margot and Alice track down Emily on the street. When they call out to her, she says her time at Breakbills is in the past. Alice explains that Charlie was her brother, which convinces Emily to talk to them. Emily then shares her story. While at Breakbills, she had fallen in love with a married professor and started an affair with him. When the professor ended things, Emily was heartbroken and desperate to win him back. She decided to use magic to make herself more beautiful, even though it was dangerous. However, the spell went horribly wrong and disfigured her face. Overwhelmed, she went to Woof Fountain, intending to end her life. Charlie saw her leaving the dorm room in tears and stopped her. He promised to fix her face and quickly prepared a spell, but it was completely untested. Charlie drew far more magical energy than he could handle. Consequently, the spell spiraled out of control and burned him with blue fire until he disappeared. Emily explains that Charlie became a Nif in a state where someone is destroyed by magic, leaving only the magic itself behind. Meanwhile, Elliot and Quentin carry the box containing the Volume 2 book and arrive outside the grocery store where Marina's group operates. As they reach the door, the magical book gets even more agitated. Elliot uses a spell to scan the building and discovers heavy magical wards. He figures it's a hedge witch hideout, a group of people with magical ability, but not skilled enough to attend breakbills. They enter the shop, and Elliot persuades the staff to let them into the back room. Inside, they find a group of witches including Julia struggling with simple spells far easier for trained breakbills students. Elliot tells the group they're from breakbills and demands their missing book. The witches deny having it, but suddenly a door bursts open, and a book flies into the room. The book inside Elliot's box breaks free, and both books fly toward each other. They land on the floor and start mating, surprising everyone. It turns out that the book is the one Katie stole from the physical kids' dorm room and gave to Marina. After recovering the books, Elliot and Quentin leave the store. Julia follows Quentin outside and confronts him. Our hero is confused as to why she's involved with hedge witches, saying she's better than that. Julia argues that she didn't have the same opportunities Quentin had, and that magic wasn't simply handed to her. Frustrated, Julia leaves the scene while Quentin and Elliot return to breakbills. Cut to Shanghai. Penny wanders through the busy streets, clearly lost, when a truck suddenly pulls up in front of him. Professor Sunderland is driving and tells him to get in. Inside, Penny finds Dean Fogg waiting. Penny asks what's happening to him, and they explain that he isn't just psychic, he's a traveler, a rare magical discipline. Travelers can instantly transport themselves anywhere, even across worlds, though the ability is dangerous and could kill them without proper training. Dean Fogg tells Penny it's time to stop feeling sorry for himself, as he no longer has the luxury of wasting time. Sunderland then tells him they'll start one-on-one lessons immediately, to prevent him from teleporting himself into something deadly, like a volcano.